Welcome to Ground Rules, Employment Law Over Your Coffee Break. My name's Pam Howland, and I'm here today with Doug Plass and Jennifer Walrath, and we're talking about some wage and hour best practices. And I have to say, here in 2025, we have seen an uptick in wage claims, at least in Idaho, where we practice law. So we thought it might be worth a little bit of time and attention to talking about some basic fundamental wage and hour practices that employers of all sizes should keep in mind. For sure, if you're a new business just getting started, you should be thinking about these things because generally they apply to businesses of all sizes. But maybe even if you're a more sophisticated employer, it's time to pull out, maybe like an audit sheet and think through whether you've got the right practices and protocols in place for the employees you have. Sometimes we see employers, maybe you've grown or maybe roles have changed or shifted. Maybe your timekeeping process is different. Maybe things have changed that would justify you taking a minute or two and thinking through some of the common pitfalls that lead to claims when it comes to wage and hour issues. So we have our own Doug Plass, who does a lot of wage and hour work here. I think in maybe some sick kind of way, Doug likes it. And so Doug, kick us off here. What are some tips for employers to have in mind thinking through wage and hour best practices and basic concepts?
Thanks, Pam. Yeah, I don't know how much I like, but I like it a bit anyway.
In a sick kind of way.
In a sick kind of way. Place that I always like to start is a place that we often start, which is record keeping. So employers need to, the Fair Labor Standards Act requires that employers keep all number of records. But what's really important for wage and hour claims are time records. So if you do not keep good time records and there is some sort of dispute as to how much an employee worked, you don't have a record to present, basically the employee is going to benefit from the presumption that whatever they report is the correct thing, and you're going to have to scramble around and try to disprove that if it's not true. So keeping good time records is something that all employers should do, and if they do, it's really going to benefit them in this case.
Yeah. Jennifer, any thoughts on that one?
Maybe not record keeping per se, but I guess what I would say is, where that really comes into play is for your employees who are potentially eligible for overtime pay, right?
Sure.
So, for some employers, not that there aren't any record keeping requirements for your, exempt employees, but it may be less important. That being said, right? I think where we often see employers go wrong, and sometimes even, larger, more sophisticated employers, is not having their employees properly categorized, right? And I can let Doug dive into this a little more, but I would say, whenever we do trainings on this, for example, one of the questions we always ask is, if you're a salaried employee, are you exempt? And almost always you'll see hands go up saying, yes, that's the case. That may be the case, but it really is not the test, right? Like paying an employee a salary isn't going to be the thing that determines if they are exempt under the Fair Labor Standards Act or non-exempt. And those are terms that I hope listeners are somewhat familiar with, but if they're not, I'm sure we'll dive into that more here today. But all to say, it's important to understand those terms, know what they mean, what does it mean for your workforce, because it's going to affect things like what is it most important for record keeping purposes, what kinds of records do you need to keep for your hours, who needs to keep them, and all those things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and maybe let's even take a step back and go even higher level here. Maybe if you're a newer employer listening to this, some of these more general concepts are not familiar to you. So sometimes we get employers who are surprised to learn that according to the Department of Labor, there is basically a presumption that employees are non-exempt, which means they're entitled to overtime when they work more than 40 hours in a week. So there is this presumption that if you have employees in your workplace, that they should be keeping time, and that you as the employer are responsible for that. And that if they're working more than 40 hours, you're going to pay them time and a half for that. So that's the presumption you're starting with. And there are a few exemptions. The white collar exemptions are the big bucket that typically apply in somewhat of an office setting when you have employees who maybe perform higher level tasks with more judgment, more discretion, more supervisory roles. There are some employees who may meet a test, and it's a very specific test that they have to meet, where they don't have to keep time and where you don't have to pay them overtime if they work more than 40. But it's a very specific test. We can talk a little bit more about that. And just because you've got someone in your office who you want to pay a salary, as Jennifer was talking about, that certainly doesn't mean that they are exempt and that you don't have to pay them overtime. So those are important concepts for business owners to know and understand, and to know that if you want someone to be exempt, you got to be able to justify that decision if the DOL comes knocking, which is a topic for a different podcast that we're doing. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, and on that topic, so without digging into the weeds of the specific exemptions too much, generally there's kind of this way that they follow, right? So one thing is you have to pay the employee enough. So they are guaranteed an amount of money on a weekly basis that is, at least as much as what the exemption states. So right now, is it $684 a week? I'm not sure.
I know. I was just thinking I should have looked that up before.
Yeah.
It has changed a lot in the past few years,
Well,
which is
it's
why we're
changed,
scratching
but then
our
it changed
heads.
back. But at any rate, you have to pay enough money. You have to pay the minimum amount, and this is an and you have to meet the duties test. So whatever the duties are that qualify for the exemption, that has to happen as well. So when you say you pay someone a salary, that tells me part of one half of that, right? It tells me that you're guaranteeing an amount, doesn't tell me if it's enough, and it also doesn't tell you anything about what that employee does. So that's understanding exemptions, and the exemptions are not just for overtime; they're for minimum wage as well. Although some exemptions are only for overtime. So understanding all that is a good place to start. And then if you have some employees, and most employees are in this bucket, that are eligible for an overtime premium of one half of their regular pay for hours worked over 40, you need to understand how to calculate that overtime. So, for instance, there may be a situation where you have an employee that gets a different pay rate for different tasks that they do. Or you may have a situation where an employee is paid by the item they produce, or they're paid, they're some sort of non-exempt employee that earns commissions. All of that compensation enters into the base rate. So all non-discretionary pay that an employee has earned in any particular week. So first of all, you have a week in which the employee has worked more than 40 hours in a week. Okay, start with that. How much is their base pay rate? Add up whatever their hourly pay is, whatever non-discretionary bonuses they got, whatever commissions they got, whatever piece rate work they got. Put that all in a bucket, divide that by the hours worked. That's going to give you the base rate on which the overtime premium of 50% is calculated. We see employers mess this one up again and again, and it's complicated. It changes from week to week, and every week you could have a different base rate. So employers need to keep that in mind as well.
And call for help. So you just heard it. If that was making your hands sweat, hearing Doug describe that, because I was like, oh, that sounds like math. That's why I went to law school, right? So I didn't have to do math. Call for help. Don't just guess, because the wage and hour stuff is somewhat complex frequently. So if you don't know, don't risk messing it up. It's really important that you know the rules and that you're in compliance with them.
Yeah, I agree. It also kind of makes my palms sweat a little bit too. That's why Doug gets to do all this work. No, I just. Another thing I think we see a lot too is not even just calculating the actual amount of pay, but kind of this idea too of, what is work time, what is not work time. And there are a lot of rules out there about, are you commuting to the office? Generally speaking, commuting to the office is not paid time. But what if you are a plumber or a contractor who works on site at someone's house, and that's your office, that's your work location for right now? Or maybe you have to go to 2 different homes or locations throughout the day. How do you treat the time getting to the first place or in between the 2 places where you're going to be working on a given day? There are rules and regs out there that help you assess whether that time is going to be paid work time or not, because the general overarching rule this is for your non-exempt, generally your hourly employees, must be paid for all time they are actually working. So you get into this assessment, right, of is it work time, is it not? If you work somewhere where you have to wear safety equipment, is the time spent putting on that equipment work time? If you work in an office and you have a computer that takes 5 minutes to boot up, are you getting paid for the amount of time that it takes for your computer to turn on and get going? And these might sound like they should be simple questions with simple answers, but that's not always the case. And you'd be surprised how frequently we get these kinds of questions. Or say you have someone who works for a service role, and maybe they have a work cell phone. What if they get calls from customers after hours and they answer those calls, right? So just thinking ahead for the kinds of jobs, for the employees you have, what are the circumstances that come up where you have these questions about whether or not someone should be paid for that time, and kind of think ahead and maybe the answer that might seem the most logical to you may be correct, but it may not. And it's worth actually digging into it and figuring out what the right answer is, because paying your people appropriately is important and matters, so that you don't end up having claims or the DOL coming knocking on your door and having problems with an audit, for example.
And that brings up the next thing on my list, Jennifer, which is pay for all time worked. So if you have a situation where, an employee impermissibly works some overtime hours, or they start too early, or even if they engage in some kind of bad conduct while they're at work, a lot of times we'll see employers say, well, gosh, I don't have to pay them for that. I told them not to work late and they disobeyed me. So, I'm off the hook. No, you're not. So there's kind of 2 things that you need to keep separate here. One is the amount of time that the employee actually worked, and the second is any discipline for performance or conduct violations that the employee has engaged in. Keep those things separate. If the employee does something you've told them not to do, you are perfectly within your rights to discipline them for doing that. However, if that involves doing some work for you, you need to pay them for that work.
Yeah, and withholding too. So that's another issue that we see employers trip up on, is sometimes, as we all know, terminations, separations, sometimes resignations are a little bit emotionally charged, right? So we've seen employers call and say, I had an employee walk off the job, they kept their uniform, and I'm just going to go ahead and withhold $100 out of their last paycheck. So there are very specific rules that dictate what types of things can be withheld from pay. What Doug was talking about is a little different. If there's work performed, you have to pay that. There's really no leeway there. But when it comes to other deductions from pay, The rules are very specific on that too. And in Idaho, I think those are some state specific differences. In Idaho, we've got a law that says unless the employee has signed in writing some type of permission allowing you to withhold, you don't get a withhold for keys, uniforms, equipment, anything like that an employee may have or maybe didn't return when they left your employment. So that's really important to know too.
And while we're on this subject briefly of Idaho law, the other thing to also know is that once someone has left your employment, you are to pay their last paycheck essentially before the next regularly scheduled payday. So, or upon the next regularly scheduled payday. One thing to be aware of, though, is that if the employee who is departing sends you a written request for their pay, that then triggers a 48-hour window in which to pay them. And this actually came up recently. We had a client who someone resigned and sent a written letter saying, this is my written request for my paycheck. And that meant that if you're going to comply with the law here in Idaho, you have a much shorter window and probably just have to run a special payroll to pay that person and make sure they get their paycheck. So just something to keep in mind. It was, in that case, surprising to the employer that was the case. And, got it done, all sorted. But just be aware of that there are some timelines and special rules here in Idaho about when to pay your people upon exit from your employment.
And that's a state-specific one too. So all states are different on that. So if you have offices or employees in other states, make sure you know those rules because chances are they're not going to look just like Idaho's. So we've talked a little bit about keeping time, maybe that means you should be looking right now, like what's our system for time tracking? Do we have the right app or the right software, the right system? That's stuff that's evolving all the time. You probably got some great options out there you could explore. Policies. We haven't really talked about policies, but geez, do we ever have a podcast where we're not talking about policies in some shape or form? Super important that your handbook has a policy that addresses wage and hour issues. And there's a handful of things that policy needs to say. It needs to talk about no off-the-clock work being permitted, that if employees think they haven't been paid right, they need to come to you and request it, and that you're going to investigate it and get them paid correctly as soon as possible without any retaliation on the back end. So policies, super important. You guys think of anything else in that policy? I didn't.
Yeah, I just want to mention there's one that can come up, and it's super important. If you have exempt employees, you want to have what's called a safe harbor provision in your policies. And this safe harbor provision can help you avoid having losing that exemption if you make some sort of mistake, right? Basically what this says is that even if you make an impermissible deduction from the pay of an exempt employee, you can cure that, you can fix that. And still maintain the exempt status. So if you don't have this policy and then you accidentally deduct something incorrectly from the pay of an exempt employee, you might find yourself facing an overtime claim and not have any records at all about the time that this person worked, and it can create lots of problems. So while we're talking about policies, get that in there, definitely.
Yep. So update your handbook. Look at your wage and hour policy, make sure you've got the right stuff there, double check your time tracking system, consider an audit, for your positions. If you're claiming someone is exempt from overtime, have you looked at that test lately? And are you sure that the people in those roles meet both the salary basis and the duties test? Like, do an audit. That's good stuff. And consider your documentation, like contracts. We talked about how you can't withhold something from a paycheck unless you have an employee give you permission. maybe there are situations where it makes sense to have some kind of writing that you get from employees during their onboarding to ensure that if they keep their laptop or their phone or their tools or something, that you can withhold some of that from a paycheck. So those are all good things. Last of all, I just wanted to mention, so what happens if someone thinks that they were entitled to overtime, for example, or maybe they were misclassified? I mean, what happens if you're an employer on the receiving end of a lawsuit? A couple things with that. So one is if an employee brings a lawsuit under Idaho state law or Wage Claim Act, they can get triple damages if you withheld compensation they were entitled to. So they can get triple damages and their attorney's fees covered if they prevail. Not in every case, but in some cases. And that makes those cases somewhat appealing if you are a contingency attorney. So those can be very dangerous claims for employers to have to defend against. Doug was talking about the scenario. What if you don't keep records and someone claims that they were worked more than 40 hours a week and you don't have any records to either prove or disprove that? That's a really bad position to be in if you're an employer. I mean, how does the employee prove it? Just their testimony, right? You could have an employee, which we've had, saying, well, I was working 15-hour days. So clearly I'm entitled to a lot of overtime, and you as the employer are the one required to keep the records. So pretty hard to disprove testimony, which is what you'll ultimately be left with if there are no records to show how much your employees are working. So that's another thing to think about.
And then also, so Pam mentioned, Idaho state law, but under the federal statute, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, it's not triple damages, but it's double and then some, which is, if you have a overtime or a minimum wage claim, the employee would be entitled to liquidated damages equal to the actual amount of wages that were withheld. So it's double damages in that case. In addition, there are some civil money penalties you can be assessed with payable to the federal government as well, and those can get pretty steep pretty fast. So, all good reason to keep your house in order.
Yeah, and even in the federal law too, I'll just throw in there, if you have enough employees who have an issue with how you've paid them, you could even be looking at what's called a collective action, which essentially is a class action of employees who have similar types of claims under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So all of which can become very expensive, very fast. Definitely why we would recommend get your house in order now. Take a little time, little bit of resources to focus on it, make sure everything's set up right, you're paying your people right, they're classified right. I think it's going to be worth it down the road to make sure you avoid something like that happening.
Yep. And maybe you're a new business, maybe you're just getting into HR or other leadership issues related to compliance. If you're looking for a resource, we have our Law for Leaders book, The Roadmap Every Leader Needs to Know to Avoid Workplace Claims and Lawsuits, and Chapter 14 is about wage and hour issues. So that's one more example of a pretty good resource to go to where, you've got all the basic concepts or detailed in that one chapter. So check that out too. So otherwise, that's it for today. We'll see you next time on Ground Rules.
Ground Rules hosts and guests are not providing legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction.